So I used to live in Illinois, right? And I had a best friend named Addie, and I lived right next to an abandoned house. And us being little kids, we thought every abandoned house was haunted. So we'd always go over there and try to see if we could see ghosts or whatever. And half the time we'd fake that we did and scare each other. But one thing we always wanted to do was to go inside of it. So one day we're outside of the house and we're looking through the window. And we're just talking, we're like, wow, we really want to go in there. So then we're like, whoa, what if we just break the window? So my friend Addie grabbed a fucking brick and threw it at the window. So the window breaks and it's really loud, so we run inside. And my mom heard it and she was like, what was that? And we didn't want to tell her because we'd get in fucking trouble. Well, a few days later, we found out it was not an abandoned house and it was a house under renovation. Ha!
Creepy story time. I actually have a picture to go along with this story, so I'll share it at the end of the video. So when my son was about a year old, we went to Burlington. It was early in the morning. I remember I dropped my daughter off at school and I went straight to Burlington. When we get there, I head over to the clothes section. The minute I get to that section, I can feel a presence. I try to ignore it because I'm with my son, so I'm just there trying to interact with him, trying to keep him entertained. He's a year old. And I continue to feel this presence just getting closer and closer and closer to where we're at, to the point where I'm like, I need to go. Before I left, I took a picture of him because he looked so cute with his little Ninja Turtle hat. Didn't think anything of it, went home. When I went home, I look at my phone and I see the picture and I see this. So here's my son with his cute little Ninja Turtle hat. But whose hand is that? Whose hand is reaching for the cart? There was no one around. I'm the one taking the pictures. I'm behind the camera. It doesn't even have fingernails. Whatever it was, we never figured it out.
If you're ever walking and hear a sound behind you, look up, for it might be the Gashadokuru. The Gashadokuru are skeleton giants who walk around in the middle of the night. If they see a human, they will quietly walk up behind them, bite off their head, and drink their spraying blood. Soldiers that die on the field and people that die of starvation usually do not have their final rites read. In Japanese culture, that means that their soul cannot pass on and they're reborn as a hungry ghost. When the bones of hundreds of those souls gather together, they become the skeleton monster known as Gashadokuru. If you're a fan of monsters, scary stories, and lore, please support this channel. Thank you guys.
What is a creepy, unexplained childhood experience that you had?
When I was a kid, my family and I lived in a house in Texas. It was a 2-story house and my parents were putting my little sister to sleep in her crib. Then they went on downstairs and I continued to play with my toys at the top of the staircase. For some random reason, I decided to look at the bottom of the staircase and I saw my sister crawling around on the ground. So I thought to myself, I wonder how she got down there. Then I remembered, my parents had just put her in the crib about 5 minutes ago. So while I stare at her, I realize that she's a little pale and she has huge black eyes, but otherwise she looks just like my sister. So naturally, I start screaming and my parents come running. I'm hysterical and my parents are asking me what's wrong. I point and I say, look, there's Sneha, she's at the bottom of the staircase. But she was gone. Around my 18th birthday, my family and I took a trip to India. We were visiting my grandma and one night she decided to oil and braid my hair and my sister's hair. So as my grandma was braiding my sister's hair, she looked over at my mom and she said, Ritu, Sneha's twin would have been a girl. I look at my mom and I say, what twin? And my mom looks at me and says, Swasti, I never told you this, but I miscarried Sneha's twin.
This story from an EMT creeped me out. They responded to a call for a car accident. And despite their best efforts, it was fatal for a 16-year-old girl. While they were there, a truck came flying up the road. And a man got out and said, where's my daughter? But they hadn't contacted any family members yet. He said he had gotten a text that said, Daddy, I need you, with her location. But her phone had been smashed into pieces.
This is why you should always watch videos to the end. In 2003, a woman came home to her apartment to see that her door was unlocked. She went inside, nothing was missing, so she assumed she must have left it open. When it happened a few more times, but still nothing was missing in her apartment, she went out and got a camera, set it up in her apartment aimed at the front door. The next day, her door was unlocked, so she reviewed the footage. She watches in horror as late in the night, her front door opens and in walks this tall, creepy man who looks around and then walks towards her bedroom off camera. She immediately sprints out of her apartment and calls the police, who show up and tell her to go back in her apartment and just try to stay calm, and that they would put an officer right outside her door so she's safe. As she's sitting on the bed, totally traumatized, she realizes something. She only saw him enter her apartment on that video. She doesn't know if he actually left. As she's sitting there, she feels breathing on her ankles. She runs out, the cop comes in, and he finds the tall, creepy man under the bed holding a knife and a camera.
Story time! When you're admitted to hospital, they place a white wristband on your wrist with your name on it. But did you know there are other coloured wristbands that symbolise different things? So for example, red wristbands are put on dead people. There was this one surgeon, he'd just finished an operation and he was on his way down to the car park ready to head home. He entered the lift and there was just one other person there. He casually chatted to the woman, you know, the usual kind of awkward elevator convo. When the lift door opened, another lady was about to enter when the doctor slammed the close button and pushed the button to the highest floor. "What on earth are you doing?" the woman in the lift said. "That was so bloody rude." "That was the woman I just operated on," said the doctor. "She died during the operation. Didn't you see her red wristband?" The woman smiled, raised her wrist and said, "Something like this."
So this is my story about the time I heard La Llorona right outside my living room window. This actually happened this past November. One night I'm sitting in the living room, I'm with my boyfriend, I'm with my daughter, we're watching a movie. It is well past midnight when I start to hear what sounds like this humming coming from the distance. I of course try to ignore it, just like all things paranormal. Anytime I hear things that just don't make sense, I ignore it. But it keeps getting louder and louder and closer and closer. That's what I heard, but without the words, it was just the humming. So I asked my daughter, I'm like, "Do you hear that?" So she pauses the movie and she can hear it. I then asked my boyfriend, I'm like, "Can you hear it?" Mind you, he's the biggest skeptic. So when he said, "Yeah, I actually hear that too," like I was like, oh shit. Quick little side note, I live right across the street from the cemetery. Let's just say that our movie night pretty much ended after that and we all went upstairs. So this is my story about the time I heard La Llorona right outside my living room window. This actually happened this past November. One night I'm sitting in the living room, I'm with my boyfriend, I'm with my daughter, we're watching a movie. It is well past midnight when I start to hear what sounds like this humming coming from the distance. I of course try to ignore it, just like all things paranormal. Anytime I hear things that just don't make sense, I ignore it. But it keeps getting louder and louder and closer and closer. That's what I heard, but without the words, it was just the humming. So I asked my daughter, I'm like, "Do you hear that?" So she pauses the movie and she can hear it. I then asked my boyfriend, I'm like, "Can you hear it?" Mind you, he's the biggest skeptic. So when he said, "Yeah, I actually hear that too," like I was like, oh shit. Quick little side note, I live right across the street from the cemetery. Let's just say that our movie night pretty much ended after that and we all went upstairs.
One time, Corona. Anyways, one time when I was sophomore in high school, I got shingles and it hurt really bad. So the doctor had to prescribe me codeine medicine for the pain, and I was supposed to take 1 to 2 tablets every day, or whenever it was hurting. And this particular night, it was hurting a little extra, so I decided that I would take 2 instead of 1. But honestly, I was vibing, having a good time until I fell asleep, and then like 6 hours later, I woke up to a scratching noise coming from behind me. So I turned around to look at what it was, and I saw a black figure hunched over, scratching at my closet door. It had really big hair and long pointy fingers. But yeah, I saw this thing and I stared at it for so long that I started to cry and I started to scream at it, thinking it was my mom because she was pulling a prank. But then my brother came in and opened the door and told me to shut up. The end.
One night I fell asleep to a bunch of late night commercials. I slept all the way through until midnight or so, until something started playing on the TV that woke me. It was another commercial. I was ready to go back to sleep when I heard my name be mentioned. Now, my name's pretty common, so that's not too unusual, but it was definitely enough to hold my interest for a little bit longer. The commercial showed some guy in a costume. He had this cheesy red makeup on and horns on his head that made him look like a stereotypical devil. When I listened carefully, I realised that it wasn't just a cheesy product he was selling. He said he was selling a human soul, but not just any soul, my soul. He mentioned my full name and said all the buyer needed to do was call to make their purchase. I was tempted to call myself to see what the heck was going on, but someone beat me to it. The sound of a phone ringing came from my TV. The moment that happened, all of the lights in my house went out.
My paranormal activity story has been requested so many times, so here it is. So back in April of last year, I had went through a breakup after 5 years of dating. And I moved in with a friend who had just recently purchased a house. She worked night shift as a respiratory therapist, and when she would come home, she would often see shadows hanging over her. We kind of just thought she was tired, so we didn't really look into it. But a few weeks in, I started to get sleep paralysis, which I had never gotten before. I never saw anything during these episodes, but I could always hear a woman laying next to me, and I could physically feel her petting me. My friend began to get some night terrors, and we started to see some black spots on the ceiling. One night, I came home with a friend, and from the back, we both heard, "Hey baby, are there any people here?" We both just looked at each other. Like, "Did you hear that?" "Yes." "Did you hear that?" "Yeah." So we immediately called my friend and she came home. We ended up having to get in contact with someone who could do a house cleansing. She warned us that we had both let something in and that there was a negative male presence around the house. She also said that the rotting of the house was about to get worse. Like and follow for part 2.
This is a story time on my new haunted doll, Tilly. Now, I actually found Tilly in a thrift store. Yes, you can find a haunted doll in a thrift store. So I go to them, I see what doll calls out to me. If I feel like any is haunted, I instantly picked up her. And I felt a connection immediately. I almost felt obsessed. And that kind of scares me because I'm like, she has this really strong connection with her, and maybe it's not safe to bring her home. But I didn't feel like it was a dangerous spirit or anything. So yes, I brought her home and I'm in love with her. Absolutely, she's beautiful. And so I went live with you guys. A lot of you guys saw it. Used my dowsing rods, asked her some questions, and the questions I asked her and the answers will shock you. I guess she was born in the 1970s. She was 6 years old when she died. Her father killed her, and she told me the reason I have a connection with her is because I'm her mother in a past life.
Mary was a 5-year-old twin. She just loved playing with her twin sister. They'd just play with their dolls in the dollhouse every day. But the year Mary turned 6, her parents sat her down and said, "It's time we finally told you." They told her that she was a twin, but her twin sister died at birth, and she no longer existed. Mary, frustrated, went straight to her wardrobe, opened it, and said, "Well, who's this then?" She opened the wardrobe door only to see another Mary standing there looking straight at her. Her mum giggled and said, "Sweetie, that's your reflection in the mirror." Mary slowly closed the wardrobe door, and the little girl in the mirror stepped forward and said, "Shh, don't tell them. They just won't understand."
This is why you should always trust your gut. In the 1970s, a young couple decided to go for a late night hike in the woods. A couple minutes into their walk, and the man remembers thinking something's not right. He tells his girlfriend, but they just decide to ignore it and keep going, until he steps on something that felt really soft, like it was alive. Before he has a chance to see what he stepped on, they hear all this rustling in the bushes next to them and they bolt. Years later, that couple turns on the TV and a death row inmate who's about to be executed is being interviewed. And they ask him, "Was there ever a time that you were almost caught red-handed?" He responded, "Yes, one time. I was in the woods and a couple walked through and the man actually stepped on the body of a girl I had just killed. I was hiding in the bushes just a few feet away. They didn't see me." That couple had run into one of the worst serial killers of all time, Ted Bundy.
This is why you should never try using a Ouija board. My friends and I decided to play with a Ouija board after work in our office and spoke to a girl named Quinn. She didn't say much but seemed friendly enough, but when I mentioned my girlfriend, she got super mad and protective of me. When it got to 2 a.m, we said goodbye to her, but about a week later, in the middle of the night, the office block that we worked in burnt down. It creeped us all out, so a week later we used the Ouija board again near a lake and asked for Quinn. When we got through to her, we asked if she started the fire, to which she responded, yes. About 2 weeks later, I was driving to my girlfriend's house with the board in the back of the truck. I didn't know it at the time, but my girlfriend was in fact cheating on me. But I guess Quinn knew because I lost control of the truck and flipped it upside down. When the cops arrived to make sure I was okay, they reminded me what road I was on. Route 666, Virginia.
Story time. So a couple of years ago, I went on a night out with some of my friends, and after a few drinks, I had that heart-sinking feeling when I realised that I'd lost my phone and that it wasn't in my pocket. We searched everywhere. We searched the table we were sat at, we searched the bar, we searched the bathrooms, we literally searched that place high and low. And after no luck, I asked my friend if I could borrow her phone to call mine. After 2 rings, somebody answered and let out a low, raspy giggle. It was really quite freaky. They hung up and they never answered again. Eventually, after hours of searching, myself and my friends, we just gave it up as a lost cause and we decided to head home. Now the weirdest part. When I got home, guys, my phone was lying on my nightstand, so I mustn't have taken it out in the first place. So who answered and who let out that raspy giggle?
This is why you should always change your locks. In 2017, a college girl woke up from a nightmare drenched in sweat and decided to rinse off before going back to sleep. She propped her phone on a shelf, turned on some music, and then hopped in the shower. A few minutes later, she reaches for her phone to change the song, but stops suddenly. Reflected on her phone's screen was a person standing in the middle of her bathroom facing the shower. She somehow kept her composure, turned the water to scalding hot, and then ripped open the curtain and sprayed the intruder in the face. As they howled in pain, she ran past them to her kitchen to get her butcher's knife. In a panic, she can't find her knife, so she just runs out of the apartment and calls the police. The police go in and come out with a crazy-looking woman in handcuffs. One of the officers comes over to the girl and says she used to live here and she had copies of your keys. Then he pauses and looks down and brings up a clear evidence bag that contained her butcher's knife, and he says, "Looks like she wanted her apartment back."
This house was so haunted, nobody could live there. In the 1870s, a family living in Surrency, Georgia, started experiencing terrifying paranormal activities in their home. They reported witnessing objects soaring across rooms, hearing laughter and crying, and seeing red eyes staring into their house. Food was thrown from their plates, and the utensils were twisted into unusable shapes. The townspeople speculated that these occurrences were cries for help from spirits who thought the family would be able to save them. On the day the family decided to finally leave the house, a fire iron allegedly floated up and started beating one of the sons in the head. No one was ever brave enough to live in the house again, and the building went up in flames in 1925.
Okay, so my friends live in an old rental house and they have what they call a murder room in the basement, so we're gonna go check it out. The door only locks from the outside and the doorknob is like really low. It's a really sketch vibe inside. The calendar on the wall is from 1996, so 25 years, that's weird. This is a one-way mirror, so from this side it kinda looks black, but from the other side you can see through it. We're gonna go check it out. So I would actually call it a kidnap room. Anyway, I'm just gonna climb through all this trash because it's totally worth it. Oh my god, it's real! You could like totally keep hostages in here. Yeah, that's so creepy. So that's the story.
Welcome to another story time in makeup. This is a story that I still can't make sense of. Growing up, I lived in a small village near a big field and forest. We were always told to stay out of the forest and the field because the owner would shoot on sight. One year, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, part of the field flooded and created this small lake. This lake was gross and you could clearly see the pesticides, and it made animals nearby die. You could see the lake from my bathroom window, but it was still pretty far away. One night I woke up to go pee and it was a full moon, so it was pretty well lit outside. By the lake I could see what looked like a deer circling around it. All of a sudden I heard this weird noise, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It sounded like someone whispering, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. It sounded like it was coming from downstairs. I honestly don't know what compelled me to go downstairs. I'm a massive wimp and scare easily. I went down and looked around but couldn't find anything or anyone. So I went back upstairs, and as I'm passing the front door I see a figure standing in our walkway. I get closer to see what it is. This awful smell hits me. I'll post part 2 soon.
We're starting off spooky season early with this dating horror story. So when I was 19, I went out on a date with this guy that I met on Tinder. I swear all scary dating stories start out with Tinder. We'll call him Sam. So Sam and I decided to get coffee and we hit it off pretty well. But we did make the connection that he lived about 6 blocks from me. Keep this in mind. We decided to continue and do a second date. Things got a lot weirder. During this, he asked me several questions about a girl that we'll call Mandy Smith. She was my best friend. I was entirely creeped out about how he knew a lot about her and her last name. This set off my spidey senses, so I just acted like I didn't know her. We dated for about 3 months, and he overcrossed some boundaries when it came to personal privacy a few times, but nothing was really too bad. That was until the day that my friend Mandy went missing. Sam and I were together when it came on the news. I was upset and crying over my friend, and he just looked at me and was like, I thought you didn't know her. I said I lied because I thought it was suspicious. And he literally started yelling at me over this, and it turned into a full-out argument. My parents and I then decided to do some research. Share and add me on Instagram for part 2.
You all want a scary story? Well, this is the scariest story I've got. This took place back in 6th grade when I lived in Okotoks. It was my first time living in a rural setting, something I'm pretty used to now. The Wi-Fi was terrible and I didn't have any console, so I got myself a pellet gun to pass the time. The pellets were plastic and it was only a handgun, so it was only good for putting dents in pop cans. But you better believe the strap had your boy thinking he was invincible. Oh, was I wrong. After binge watching like 3 action anime, your boy was ready to put the stick to use. I waited until everybody was asleep and then I stuck out. I decided it would be fun to explore the fields. While exploring, I fell into an oddly large hole. I knew it wasn't a gopher hole, it was too large. I assumed that maybe it was a colony of gophers that made the hole. I was so very wrong. As I continued my investigation, I saw dirt flying through the air. So I unloaded about half my clip towards it. Dirt stopped and I saw a figure in the shadows. So I took a step closer. I was right to assume it wasn't a gopher, because it was a fucking badger. And then I heard the growl that I will never forget. I've never ran as fast in my entire life.
Story time. Last night, a friend begged me to catch the opening act at a local bar's music night and arrived to pick me up with only a moment's notice. After a few drinks, I realised my phone wasn't in my pocket. I checked the table we were sitting at, the bar, the bathrooms, and after no luck, I used my friend's phone to call mine. After 2 rings, someone answered. They gave out a low, raspy giggle and then hung up. I immediately tried to call back, but they didn't answer. I eventually gave it up as a lost cause and headed home, where I found my phone lying on my nightstand, right where I had left it.
This is part 2 of my dating horror story. My parents and I searched his image on Google, and it came up with so many different Instagram and so many different Facebook accounts. They all had different names like Peter and Noah and Kevin and James. I had no idea who this man even was, so we decided to do some more investigating. We ended up getting the police involved, and we found out this man had a criminal record. Been watched for a while for the potential killing of his 2 ex-girlfriends. They said because he lived so close to me, I could have been his next victim. They had told me originally that he was 18, but under police records, he was 23. I ended up helping out with his investigation process, and he's now in jail for the murder of his ex-girlfriends. And now he's about to be tried for my missing friend as well. The moral of the story is to please, please, please background search people before you go out with them. I love you guys and I hope you all stay safe. And if you have a story that you'd like to share, follow me on Instagram and DM me.
This is legit one of the spookiest things that's happened to me. There's been a few. Story time. This happened literally 20 years ago too. I just started a new job and met one of my colleagues' sons. He was a young tradie, really sweet, nice guy. He gave me his phone number and said, if there's anything I can do to help out ever, just give me a buzz. And I found myself stranded in the city one night with no way of getting home. So I called him. He showed up like a knight in shining armor and I got home safely. Absolute legend. But about a week later, he was found dead in suspicious circumstances. I was talking to his mother and obviously she was absolutely distressed. She really needed answers and had no idea what had happened. And then a feeling came to me that there was a spray paint can involved and she should look for it. Well, she found it and that's how they worked out what happened to him.
This story is called The Babysitter. In 2014, Marty Thompson comes home from school and he's startled to see an older woman that's not his mum in the kitchen. The woman turns and quickly says, "Hey Marty, I'm Denise. I'm the babysitter. Your mum and dad are tied up at the moment and they've asked me to look after you." She says, "Why don't you run upstairs and play for a bit and I'll make us some food." Marty doesn't think much of it, so he just goes upstairs to his room. About an hour or so later, Marty's upstairs playing on his Xbox when his phone rings. He looks over and sees it's his mum and answers. His mum sounds quite panicked and says, "Marty, where are you?" Marty just keeps playing and casually says, "I'm at home with the babysitter. Where are you?" His mum goes silent for a little bit. She then says, "Marty, your father and I are tied up in the basement. We don't have a babysitter."
This is why you should always keep pictures of your parents. A little girl named Olivia who lived a very quiet life decided to check her homework assignments that were posted online. The teacher posted that they needed to write down their favorite memory with their family as well as bring a photograph. Olivia then writes about how her and her mom play dolls every night in the basement before bed and that she has a lot of fun doing so. She finishes her paragraph and then looks in her dad's drawer for a photograph of mom. She only found pictures of her mom from high school but decided to use it anyway. Olivia goes to bed and wakes up the next morning. Once she arrives at school, the teacher then says, "Let's start presenting our project." Then the teacher called Olivia's name to present. Olivia then begins to read about how her and her mom play dolls every night and then pulls out the photograph. As soon as Olivia pulled out the photograph, her teacher's face goes numb. She then asks Olivia if she can take a closer look at the photograph. She then recognized her mom as one of her previous students. Then the teacher asks, "Where did you get this photo?" Olivia says, "My dad keeps them in his drawer." The teacher, shocked, sits down Olivia and pulls out an old newspaper. The newspaper headline, "Local high school teen murdered, boyfriend gone missing." The teacher then looks at Olivia and says, "Your mom has been dead for 14 years.
This is why you always say yes to tandoori chicken. In 2012, a high school tutor and her student stayed up so late one night studying that by the time they were done, the buses had stopped running. Without another way home, the student asked if he could stay the night at her place. Reluctantly, she agreed. When they got back to the apartment, she fell asleep on her bed and he fell asleep on a blanket next to her bed on the ground. A few hours later, she wakes up to the boy standing awkwardly in the middle of the room with a very strange look on his face. She asks him, "What's wrong?" He looks at her and says, "I'm really hungry. Let's go get some tandoori chicken." Confused, she says, "It's 2 a.m. Just get a snack in the cupboard." And he grabs her by the arm and he says, "No, we are getting tandoori chicken right now." And he yanks her from the bed. Feeling totally caught off guard by this whole situation, she goes into the hall with the boy, and as soon as the door shuts behind them, she can tell that he is terrified. He looks at her and just says, "I'm not actually hungry. When I woke up, there was someone under your bed."
This boy was missing for 2 years, but you won't believe what they found under his dresser. Shannon and Michael found out they were pregnant in 2002. They were super excited but had been fighting a lot and their relationship was strained. After their son Ricky was born, they decided to break up and share custody over him. At first, everything was going well until the mother Shannon would disappear with baby Ricky for days at a time. This led to the dad Michael taking her to court for visitation rights. But she never showed up on her court date, so the judge gave the dad Michael temporary custody. But soon after, Shannon and now 4-year-old Ricky completely vanished. It became apparent that Shannon had abducted Ricky, so a warrant was issued for her arrest. Things only got stranger when Shannon's mom put up posters around the neighborhood saying Michael was the one who abducted Ricky. Suspicious she was somehow involved, Michael did his research and alerted the cops. The cops busted into the grandma's house and found a wooden dresser when they heard a sound come from beneath it.
Story time. My boyfriend and I bought a very old house. He was in charge of bringing in all the furniture and doing the heavy lifting while I was on wallpaper removal duty. The previous owner had papered every wall and ceiling. Removing it took ages but was oddly satisfying, kind of like peeling skin when you get sunburnt. I started peeling the paper away and discovered that under a corner section of paper in every room was a person's name and a date. Curiosity got the better of me, and one night I googled the names. I discovered that the person was actually a missing person, and the missing date matched the date under the wallpaper. We immediately notified the police and they sent out a crime scene team. After looking around a bit, they came up to me and said, "Where's the wallpaper you removed from the walls?" Turns out, it wasn't wallpaper. I'm done.
This is why you should never stay in sketchy motels. In 2005, a young woman on a solo road trip across the country decided to stop for the night. The first place she sees is the Mountaintop Motel. It looked pretty cheap, but she was tired, so she said good enough. The check-in guy eyed her up and down very uncomfortably and then asked her if she was traveling alone. She ignores the question, pays for her room, and then walks away with the key. When she gets inside her room and sees there are literally cockroaches in her bed, she says nope and decides to sleep in her car in the parking lot. Around 3 a.m., she wakes up to see the check-in guy using his own keys to get into the motel room she was supposed to be in. A few minutes later, he storms out and slams the door and starts walking towards her car. Terrified, she hides under her blanket as the man tries to open her car doors but can't and walks away. She speeds off and calls her friend and asks her to look up the address of Mountaintop Motel so she can give it to police. Her friend's quiet for a second and then just says, "The Mountaintop Motel closed a week ago."
If you're pregnant or know someone that is, protect them, or the Pangolin might snatch them up. The Pangolin looks like a normal looking woman until it gets dark outside. Its head detaches from its body along with its insides and flies off looking for its prey. Its favorite meal is the blood of women giving birth. It will wait on the rooftop till the birth is done, then it will reach out with its tongue and lick the blood. Before the sun comes up, the head will return to its body. The pangolin originated from Malaysian lore. If you like monsters, scary stories, and lore, please support this channel and my YouTube. Thank you guys.
Our dog Molly wouldn't sleep anywhere but my parents' room after 10 p.m. If my parents went to bed without her, she'd scratch and whine at the door until they let her in. I think it was because she was afraid of what was in the hallway after dark. One night, I had to have been 12 or 13, my mother awoke to frantic scratching at her bedroom door. It was about 3:30 a.m., which was odd. Molly would have attempted to get in by then if she'd missed bedtime. The scratching would stop for a moment, followed by the sound of long nails clacking on hardwood as Molly paced back and forth. She wasn't whining. That was also odd. The scratching started up again with such force that the door began to rattle in the frame, so my mum woke my dad up to let the dog in. "What are you talking about?" he said, and pointed to the edge of their bed where Molly now stood, hair raised, growling into the dark. The scratching grew louder. After a quick back and forth, my mother was the unlucky one who had to go check the hallway. She ripped the door open. There was nothing there.
Unless you've heard this story, there's no way you could have guessed what was on that ship. In 2012, an old Russian cruise liner was being towed to the Caribbean to be used for scrap when the tow line snapped. They tried to recover it, but it drifted into international waters and everybody just kind of assumed it would sink, so they said, forget about it. It didn't sink, because a year later they got a GPS signal from the unmanned ship showing that it had drifted nearly 2/3 of the way across the Atlantic and was now poised to strike the British coastline. At first, British authorities were not concerned with the damage this ship might cause to their coastline until scientists revealed what was on the ship.
It was being towed to the Caribbean last year when it came loose during a storm. It's now feared to be infested with cannibal rats on board, who, lacking a food source, have turned on each other.
Cannibal rats? That's pretty shocking.
What happened to Stephen Kibaki in 1977 baffles everybody, even experts. Stephen, 24 at the time, was cross-country skiing near Lake Michigan. Stephen ended up needing to take a break and taking his skis off, but when he was done with his break and he looked back, he couldn't find his own tracks to get back to where he started. He recalls walking through the woods, feeling numb and exhausted. In his mind, all he can remember is blacking out, and then the next thing he remembers, it was springtime. Sitting in a grassy field, he found a backpack, glasses, and running shoes, none of which belonged to him. He hiked to the nearest town, and they ended up telling him that he had traveled 700 miles. No one knows how he got from Lake Michigan all the way up to Pittsfield, Massachusetts. By the time he made it to the city, Kibaki had been missing for 14 months. The search team that found his poles only found one set of footprints, and they were leading to the lake, but none were leading out, leading them to believe that he may have fallen in and drowned. Obviously, he didn't end up drowning as he ended up in a new city, but if you want to find out what happened to him, like and follow for part 2.